Mozambique, officially the Republic of Mozambique, is a country in Southeast Africa bordered by the Indian Ocean to the east, Tanzania to the north, Malawi and Zambia to the northwest, Zimbabwe to the west, and Swaziland and South Africa to the southwest. It is separated from Madagascar by the Mozambique Channel to the east. The capital and largest city is Maputo. Between the 1st and 5th centuries AD, Bantu-speaking peoples migrated from farther north and west, Swahili, and later also Arab. Commercial ports existed along the coasts until the arrival of Europeans. The area was explored by Vasco da Gama in 1498 and colonized by Portugal from 1505. After over 4 centuries of Portuguese rule, Mozambique gained independence in 1975, becoming the People's Republic of Mozambique shortly thereafter. After only 2 years of independence, the country descended into an intense and protracted civil war lasting from 1977 to 1992. In 1994, Mozambique held its first multi-party elections and has remained a relatively stable presidential republic. Mozambique is one of the poorest and most underdeveloped countries in the world. Mozambique is endowed with rich and extensive natural resources. The country's economy is based largely on agriculture, but industry, mainly food and beverages, chemical manufacturing, aluminium and petroleum production, is growing. The country's tourism sector is also growing. South Africa is Mozambique's main trading partner and source of foreign direct investment. Portugal, Brazil, Spain and Belgium are also among the country's most important economic partners. Since 2001, Mozambique's annual average GDP growth has been among the world's highest. However, the country ranks among the lowest in GDP per capita, human development, measures of inequality, and average life expectancy. The only official language of Mozambique is Portuguese, which is spoken mostly as a second language by about half of the population. Common native languages include Swahili, Makua and Sena. The country's population of around 24 million is composed overwhelmingly of Bantu people. The largest religion in Mozambique is Christianity, with significant minorities following Islam and African traditional religions. Mozambique is a member of the African Union, the Commonwealth of Nations, the Community of Portuguese-language countries, the Latin Union, the Non-Aligned Movement and the Southern African Development Community, and an observer at La Francophonie. Etymology: the country was named Mocambique by the Portuguese after the island of Mozambique, derived from Musa al-Big or Mossa al-Bik or Musa ben Mabiki, an Arab trader who first visited the island and later lived there. The island town was the capital of the Portuguese colony until 1898, when it was moved south to Lourenço Marques. History: Bantu migrations between the 1st and 5th centuries AD. Waves of Bantu-speaking people migrated from the west and north through the Zambezi River Valley and then gradually into the plateau and coastal areas. They established agricultural communities or societies based on herding cattle. They brought with them the technology for smelting and smithing iron. Swahili coast from the late 1st millennium AD. Vast Indian Ocean trade networks extended as far south into Mozambique as the ancient port town of Chibuene. Commercial settlements such as Sofala, Angoche, and others along the Mozambique and Swahili coast became important centers for the Arab, Persian, and later Portuguese trade in slaves, gold, ivory, and other commodities. Connections are evident at sites including Manyikeni for 11th–14th century ties with the inland Great Zimbabwe kingdoms. Portuguese Mozambique from about 1500, Portuguese trading posts and forts displaced the Arabic commercial and military hegemony, becoming regular ports of call on the new European sea route to the east. The voyage of Vasco da Gama around the Cape of Good Hope in 1498 marks the Portuguese entry into trade, politics, and society of the region. The Portuguese gained control of the island of Mozambique and the port city of Sofala in the early 16th century, and by the 1530s, small groups of Portuguese traders and prospectors seeking gold penetrated the interior regions, where they set up garrisons and trading posts at Sena and Tete on the river Zambezi and tried to gain exclusive control over the gold trade. The Portuguese attempted to legitimize and consolidate their trade and settlement positions through the creation of prezos tied to Portuguese settlement and administration. While prezos were originally developed to be held by Portuguese, through intermarriage they became African Portuguese or African Indian centers defended by large African slave armies known as Chicandar. Historically within Mozambique there was slavery. Human beings were bought and sold by African tribal chiefs, Arab Muslim traders and Portuguese and other European traders as well. Many Mozambican slaves were supplied by tribal chiefs who raided warring tribes and sold their captives to the prezeros. Although Portuguese influence gradually expanded, its power was limited and exercised through individual settlers and officials who were granted extensive autonomy. The Portuguese were able to wrest much of the coastal trade from Arab Muslims between 1500 and 1700, but with the Arab-Muslim seizure of Portugal's key foothold at Fort Jesus on Mombasa Island in 1698, the pendulum began to swing in the other direction. During these wars, the Mazrua and Omani Arabs reclaimed much of the Indian Ocean trade, forcing the Portuguese to retreat south. Many prezos had declined by the mid-19th century, but several of them survived. During the 19th century, other European powers, particularly the British and the French, became increasingly involved in the trade and politics of the region around the Portuguese East African territories. By the early 20th century, the Portuguese had shifted the administration of much of Mozambique to large private companies, like the Mozambique Company, the Zambezia Company and the Nyasa Company, controlled and financed mostly by the British, which established railroad lines to their neighboring colonies. Although slavery had been legally abolished in Mozambique, at the end of the 19th century the chartered companies enacted a forced labor policy and supplied cheap, often forced, African labor to the mines and plantations of the nearby British colonies in South Africa. The Zambezia Company, the most profitable chartered company, took over a number of smaller prezero holdings and established military outposts to protect its property. The chartered companies built roads and ports to bring their goods to market, including a railroad linking present-day Zimbabwe with the Mozambican port of Beira. Due to their unsatisfactory performance and the shift, under the corporatist Estado Novo regime of Oliveira Salazar, towards a stronger Portuguese control of Portuguese Empire's economy, the company's concessions were not renewed when they ran out. This was what happened in 1942 with the Mozambique Company, which however continued to operate in the agricultural and commercial sectors as a corporation, and had already happened in 1929 with the termination of the Nyasa Company's concession. In 1951, the Portuguese overseas colonies in Africa were rebranded as Overseas Provinces of Portugal. Mozambican War of Independence. His communist and anti-colonial ideologies spread out across Africa. Many clandestine political movements were established in support of Mozambican independence. These movements claimed that since policies and development plans were primarily designed by the ruling authorities for the benefit of Mozambique's Portuguese population, little attention was paid to Mozambique's tribal integration and the development of its native communities. According to the official guerrilla statements, this affected a majority of the indigenous population who suffered both state-sponsored discrimination and enormous social pressure. Many felt they had received too little opportunity or resources to upgrade their skills and improve their economic and social situation to a degree comparable to that of the Europeans. Statistically, Mozambique's Portuguese whites were indeed wealthier and more skilled than the black indigenous majority. As a response to the guerrilla movement, the Portuguese government from the 1960s and principally the early 1970s initiated gradual changes with new socio-economic developments and egalitarian policies for all. The Front for the Liberation of Mozambique initiated a guerrilla campaign against Portuguese rule in September 1964. This conflict, along with the two others already initiated in the other Portuguese colonies of Angola and Portuguese Guinea, became part of the so-called Portuguese colonial war. From a military standpoint, the Portuguese regular army maintained control of the population centers while the guerrilla forces sought to undermine their influence in rural and tribal areas in the north and west. As a part of their response to FRELIMO, the Portuguese government began to pay more attention to creating favorable conditions for social development and economic growth. Independence after 10 years of sporadic warfare and Portugal's return to democracy through a leftist military coup in Lisbon, which replaced Portugal's Estado Novo regime with a military junta, FRELIMO took control of the territory. Within a year, most of the 250,000 Portuguese in Mozambique had left, some expelled by the government of the nearly independent territory, some fleeing in fear, and Mozambique became independent from Portugal on 25 June 1975. A law had been passed on the initiative of the then relatively unknown Armando Guebuza of the FRELIMO party, ordering the Portuguese to leave the country in 24 hours with only 20 kilograms of luggage. Unable to salvage any of their assets, most of them returned to Portugal penniless. Mozambican Civil War. The new government, under President Samora Machel, established a one-party state based on Marxist principles. The new government received diplomatic and some military support from Cuba and the Soviet Union and proceeded to crack down on opposition. Starting shortly after the independence, the country was plagued from 1977 to 1992 by a long and violent civil war between the opposition forces of anti-communist Mozambican national resistance rebel militias and the FRELIMO regime. This conflict, combined with sabotage from the neighboring white-ruled state of Rhodesia and the apartheid regime of South Africa, ineffective policies, failed central planning, and the resulting economic collapse, characterized the first decades of Mozambican independence. This period was also marked by the exodus of Portuguese nationals and Mozambicans of Portuguese heritage, a collapsed infrastructure, lack of investment in productive assets, and government nationalization of privately owned industries, as well as widespread famine. During most of the Civil War, the FRELIMO-formed central government was unable to exercise effective control outside of urban areas, many of which were cut off from the capital. It is reported that in RENAMO-controlled areas, which included up to 50% of the rural areas in several provinces, health services of any kind were isolated from assistance for years. The problem worsened when the government cut back spending on healthcare. The war was marked by mass human rights violations from both sides of the conflict, with RENAMO contributing to the chaos through the use of terror and indiscriminate targeting of civilians. The central government executed tens of thousands of people while trying to extend its control throughout the country and sent many people to re-education camps where thousands died. During the war, RENAMO proposed a peace agreement based on the secession of RENAMO-controlled northern and western territories as the independent Republic of Rhodesia, but FRELIMO refused, insisting on the undivided sovereignty of the entire country. An estimated 1 million Mozambicans perished during the Civil War, 1.7 million took refuge in neighboring states, and several million more were internally displaced. The FRELIMO regime also gave shelter and support to South African and Zimbabwean rebel movements. while the governments of first Rhodesia and later South Africa backed RENAMO in the Civil War. On 19 October 1986, Samora Machel was on his way back from an international meeting in Zambia in the presidential Tripolif Tu-134 aircraft when the plane crashed in the Lebombo Mountains, near Mbzini. There were 10 survivors, but President Machel and 33 others died, including ministers and officials of the Mozambique government. The United Nations Soviet delegation issued a minority report contending that their expertise and experience had been undermined by the South Africans. Representatives of the Soviet Union advanced the theory that the plane had been intentionally diverted by a false navigational beacon signal, using a technology provided by military intelligence operatives of the South African government. Machel's successor, Joaquim Chissano, implemented sweeping changes in the country, starting reforms such as changing from Marxism to capitalism, and began peace talks with RENAMO. The new constitution enacted in 1990 provided for a multi-party political system, market-based economy, and free elections. The Civil War ended in October 1992 with the Rome General Peace Accords, first brokered by the CCM, the Christian Council of Mozambique, and then taken over by Community of Sant Gidio, under supervision of the ONUMOZ peacekeeping force of the United Nations. Peace returned to Mozambique. By 1993, more than 1.5 million Mozambican refugees who had sought asylum in neighboring Malawi, Zimbabwe, Swaziland, Zambia, Tanzania and South Africa as a result of war and drought had returned, as part of the largest repatriation witnessed in sub-Saharan Africa. Democratic-era Mozambique held elections in 1994, which were accepted by most parties as free and fair while still contested by many nationals and observers alike. FRELIMO won, under Joaquim Chissano, while RENAMO, led by Afonso Dhlakama, ran as the official opposition. By mid-1995, over 1.7 million refugees who had sought asylum in neighboring countries had returned to Mozambique, part of the largest repatriation witnessed in sub-Saharan Africa. An additional 4 million internally displaced persons had returned to their homes. In December 1999, Mozambique held elections for a second time since the Civil War, which were again won by FRELIMO. RENAMO accused FRELIMO of fraud, and threatened to return to civil war, but backed down after taking the matter to the Supreme Court and losing. In early 2000, a cyclone caused widespread flooding in the country, killing hundreds and devastating the already precarious infrastructure. There were widespread suspicions that foreign aid resources have been diverted by powerful leaders of FRELIMO. Carlos Cardoso, a journalist investigating these allegations, was murdered, but his death was not satisfactorily explained, indicating in 2001 that he would not run for a third term. Chissano criticized leaders who stayed on longer than he had, which was generally seen as a reference to Zambian President Frederick Chiluba, who at the time was considering a third term, and Zimbabwean President Robert Mugabe, then in his fourth term. Presidential and National Assembly elections took place on December 1–2, 2004. FRELIMO candidate Armando Guebuza won with 64% of the popular vote. His opponent, Afonso Dhlakama of RENAMO, received 32% of the popular vote. FRELIMO won 160 seats in Parliament. A coalition of RENAMO and several small parties won the 90 remaining seats. Armando Guebuza was inaugurated as the President of Mozambique on February 2, 2005, and served 2 5-year terms. His successor, Felipe Nyusa, became the fourth President of Mozambique on 15 January 2015. Geography and climate. At 309,475 square miles, Mozambique is the world's 36th largest country. It is comparable in size to Turkey. Mozambique is located on the southeast coast of Africa. It is bound by Swaziland to the south, South Africa to the southwest, Zimbabwe to the west, Zambia and Malawi to the northwest, Tanzania to the north and the Indian Ocean to the east. Mozambique lies between latitudes 10 degrees and 27 degrees south, and longitudes 30 degrees and 41 degrees east. The country is divided into two topographical regions by the Zambezi River. To the north of the Zambezi River, the narrow coastal strip gives way to inland hills and low plateaus. Rugged highlands are further west. They include the Nyasa Highlands, Namuli or Shire Highlands, Angonia Highlands, Tet Highlands and the Makonde Plateau, covered with Miombo woodlands. To the south of the Zambezi River, the lowlands are broader with the Mashonaland Plateau and Lubombo Mountains located in the deep south. The country is drained by 5 principal rivers and several smaller ones, with the largest and most important the Zambezi. The country has 4 notable lakes: Lake Nyasa, Lake Chuta, Lake Kaharabasa and Lake Sherwa, all in the north. The major cities are Maputo, Beira, Nampula, Tet, Quelimane, Chimwaro, Pemba, Inhambane, Xai and Lixinga. Climate: Mozambique has a tropical climate with 2 seasons, a wet season from October to March and a dry season from April to September. Climatic conditions, however, vary depending on altitude. Rainfall is heavy along the coast and decreases in the north and south. Annual precipitation varies from 500 to 900 mm depending on the region, with an average of 590 mm. Cyclones are common during the wet season. Average temperature ranges in Maputo are from 13 to 24 degrees Celsius in July to 22 to 31 degrees Celsius in February.